And they stumbled into it, he and his gang, if you want to call him a gang. Jimmy was a law-abiding citizen until he stumbled upon a bale of marijuana on the beach, and when he sold all these bales to one of his local buddies, he realized how lucrative it could be, and the rest is history. He had 12 years nonviolent. They didn't feel they were doing anything wrong because they were all very religious, and a lot of the island was working alongside him, including law enforcement at that time. And they never really thought they were doing anything wrong. They knew, of course, it was illicit, the trafficking that they did, but it wasn't near as violent and organized as the cocaine trafficking that followed it.
How did he grow into one of the biggest dope smugglers in the U.S.?
Much of the book, about half of the book, is an incredible reflection of what life was like in the Bahamas. He's now about almost 60 years old. To grow up on this tiny little place. He weighed almost 14 pounds when he was born, and I had hard time believing that until I went online and realized that while it is unusual, it's not unheard of. There's a lot of 12, 13, and 14-pound babies out there that tip the scales in their hometowns. And so Jimmy was sent to live with his aunt in New Providence in Nassau. And she was a God-fearing woman, and she raised him in the Church of God, and he went to the Catholic parochial school, and then he went on to a Baptist and Methodist high school, and then got a scholarship to college. Jimmy would eventually steal the identity of his Catholic priest whenever he would go down into Colombia to meet with the cartel. He would go dressed in the full garb of a Catholic priest. He would be blessing the immigration officers in Miami upon arrival in Colombia. He never paid for anything. Everybody thought he was bigger than life, being a priest, seldom seen in the mountains of Colombia, especially dressed to the hilt as he was in his ecclesiastical garb. And he was Father Jerome Constantinus, who was his principal at the high school. He just stole his identity. It was an amazing life. Everybody from law enforcement worked alongside him, as you'll read in the book. He had a couple police officers that knew what he was doing and actually collaborated with him to sell some of the marijuana. And as you know, his history tells us the Prime Minister of the Bahamas at the same time, shortly thereafter, was all but indicted, but he was linked to aiding the cocaine trafficking. So there was much corruption back then. But again, Jimmy despised the cocaine. It killed his partner in the end, cocaine, and he didn't like what it did to people. Jimmy was a teetotaler and is to this day. He doesn't drink. He never has. He's never smoked a cigarette. And believe it or not, all the tons of marijuana he brought into the United States, he's never tried marijuana.
So he didn't smoke it himself? How did he become such a big shot?
He was jogging on the beach. He's very health conscious. He used to be the top kickboxer growing up in Nassau as a child. People would actually come to see him. They would pay to see him kickbox in tournaments in Nassau. And he was always health conscious, and he became a scuba diving instructor on the island of Abaco after he left Nassau. He had just gotten married. He was out for a jog on the beach. He was jogging before Americans were jogging, mostly. And as a scuba diving instructor, again, he was still in great shape, and he jumped over on this remote stretch of beach a bale of marijuana, and then he jumped over another one, and he realized, what they were. There were about 40 of them that floated in. He drove to talk to his friend Sarge, the police sergeant, on the island, and he said, all these bales are washing ashore where I jog. And the policeman went down there with him, and he looked right at Jimmy and he said, anybody that wants to buy it? They each made several $100,000 total on getting rid of that marijuana. And the person that Jimmy sold it to, who he knew from Nassau, was already dealing with the Colombians, bringing in freighterfuls, and Jimmy became his partner, and they worked together up until the day they were indicted by Uncle Sam. But the stories are hilarious, how they avoided the law enforcement, where they hid the marijuana. It would be hidden in churches, in the basement of churches. The close calls they had are unbelievable, how they would trick both American and Bahamian law enforcement. And there was very little Bahamian law enforcement back then because of the corruption, and they just didn't have the boats until they were supplied by the DEA. But one of the funnier, more clever parts of the book is when they bought a compound. They bought 3 houses in Fort Lauderdale in a very nice neighborhood on a canal, and they pretended that they were owned by 3 different people. They called the Fort Lauderdale Police Department on the phone. The police department came over and they said, hi, I'm so-and-so, this is Jimmy, and this is George next door, and we want to start a neighborhood crime watch program. So they started a neighborhood crime watch. They all got signs in their front yard saying, this is crime watch area. We will report any suspicious activity, blah, blah, blah. So the police never worried about them.
Well, John, we're out of time in this segment. Can you join us over the break to finish up?
I'd be very happy to stay aboard.
Savage.
He's difficult to describe. He sounds like my dad with a PhD.
The Savage Nation. Talk 910 KNEW.
We're back speaking with John McCaslin about his new book about a drug smuggler. John, how did Jimmy Devine ultimately get caught? And thank God he did.
Jimmy was retired for 2 years. He had moved back to Nassau. Ronald Reagan was the president by then. And, of course, Ronald Reagan, unlike some of his predecessors, was cracking down on drugs, especially with Nancy Reagan and her Just Say No campaign. And interdiction became big time then. We had a couple of DEA agents killed. One in Colombia was assassinated, and then Enrique Camarena in Mexico City was kidnapped and tortured. I actually flew down to Mexico City to cover that as a reporter when Ed Meese was the Attorney General. And so Jimmy was retired and living in Nassau. The DEA, the FBI, Customs, Immigration, everybody was involved then in the fight against drugs, including the U.S. military. There had been no police presence at all, and then suddenly, 12 years later, they're using military satellites to track drug planes and drug shipments by boat. And Jimmy was in Nassau. He had more money than he ever knew what to do with. And one of the great things that I forgot to mention that you'll read in the book, Jimmy was a Robin Hood type guy, although he didn't really steal from the rich because he was operating illegally. But he took a lot of the money he made. He went back to this little island where he grew up. And every time he went back, he would take envelopes full of cash. I'm talking $10,000 in cash. He would give one envelope to the mother in the house or the wife in the house, another envelope to the husband in the house, because he knew if the husband got the envelope, the wife probably wouldn't see it. That's the way the culture was back then. So he would take an envelope for each. He did this repeatedly for all the neighbors down there that helped care for his mother when he couldn't be there after he was sent to live with his aunt. She was a very sickly woman, and he put so many of their children through college. And I'm not talking about college in the Bahamas. I'm talking about colleges in the United States, because the Bahamas doesn't really have many, maybe perhaps one in Nassau. So Jimmy was a very thoughtful person, if you can be thoughtful with money that is earned illegally. But he was back in Nassau. He was renovating. He was actually building a small apartment house, and he was going to keep one of the apartments because he had been a carpenter growing up in Nassau under his aunt, who had a construction company. And he's still doing it to this day, believe it or not, on Little Harbor Island, where the book opens up and where I have my house. And he was there, and he got a phone call from his partner, who's known as the chief in the book because we didn't want to identify him. And the chief said that I'm in a federal institution in the United States. I've been arrested. I've been indicted. You have also been indicted. You'll be arrested soon if you haven't yet. And Jimmy, what he did was cooperate with Uncle Sam. He cooperated with the DEA first in Nassau. Then when he told them about one shipment he had done in apparent collaboration with the CIA, or at least these two guys identified themselves as CIA operatives, and that's an incredible story, an incredible chapter in the book, which brings us back to Washington, D.C. for at least one chapter. And when Jimmy told him what he did on that operation, and when he told them everything he could tell them about the cocaine traffickers, they made him a government informant. He was given a government ID number. He was given a code name, which was Blue. He cooperated with the authorities. He turned in some of the big coke dealers. Instead of getting dozens, if not 50 or more years in federal prison, Jimmy was only given 5 years, which he served in 2 different federal prisons in the United States, one in Florida, one in Louisiana. I can tell you he didn't even serve the full 5 years before he got out, so he basically was slapped on the wrist at the most. And the only thing now is that they took all the money that he had in some of the foreign banks, but they didn't take all his money, and told him he can never come back in the United States. So for my book parties here in Washington in the last couple of weeks, he could not attend. He can't go anywhere else in the world, so he goes to places like London and Paris for Christmas.
Well, what do you want people to get from the book? That smuggling dope is good? That he was a great man?
You know, it's an adventure. I think the people that have read it, and it's gotten great reviews so far, compare it to an island tale, an island adventure. Many of them can't put it down. You can read the book easily in a couple of days. It's a very quick read. It's just 299 pages, I believe, and written in a flowing style. You know, I don't try to say anything in the book about marijuana legalization, whether I think it should be. That, of course, has cropped up again suddenly in the news, so the timing is good. In terms of legalization of marijuana, of course, President Obama, who has admitted to smoking marijuana and doing even harder drugs, he says he does not think that's an answer to fixing the economy, even though groups like NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, say that if you regulated marijuana like you did tobacco, which the Obama administration is getting more involved in, obviously, or alcohol more likely, then you could put $114 billion, that's $1 billion, into the economy every year. But that's not going to happen. There's too many hot spots in the world that Barack Obama's worried about.